The whole process came from actually from doing the work itself, from the phenomena of making, like working in the studio, basically just, immerse myself in the process of making. Because I mean, anicca itself, the word itself, it's a Pali word which means impermanent. So what I noticed in the process of ceramic making is that a lot of the materials that I use, there's a lot of changes happens actually throughout the process. So this long process, this long arduous process, and very technical sometimes, very elaborate sometimes, from preparing the clay, mixing the clay, turning it into slip, and then working on the models, making on the molds, and using plaster mold to shape the mold, and all those things. There's slight changes, like subtle changes that sort of signified every process. So you can't escape change. You can't. So there's always some levels of unpredictability as well in the process. When it comes to clay and ceramics and all other types of material-based practice, we always deal with the process. We always deal with the material. We always deal with the technique, and the process sometimes very arduous. But that's what fascinated me actually. That's what drawn me into this process, into ceramics in the first place, because I thought it's interesting, because then you, even though it seems to be limiting, but at the same time you get to discover this whole, the depth of the practice, the depth of the making, the intimacy with the material. It came from working with molds, with plaster mold. So I noticed that every time I use the mold, after a couple of times of slip casting, the molds gradually change. They lose their details, the interior of it, because I think because of the amount of water it contains in the clay slip, there's quite a lot of water, and the water get absorbed by the mold, and then gradually this sort of process of absorbing the water reduce the textures, the surface of the mold. Normally what I would do is, when it comes to that point that the mold becomes too abrasive, and then I have to replace it with a new one. Usually I make a new one. But at some point in time, I remember when I was looking at it, because I look at it every day, all the time, I notice about it, and then an idea came in my mind, because I look at the mold, and then I started realizing, okay, I think what if I continue using this mold indefinitely, and I just sort of wanted to see what would happen to the mold, what sort of shape will come out of this whole process. It's all about expressing time, how time that is sometimes quite abstract can be expressed in a very concrete way. Like just a stick and a stone, just sort of just intuitively. There's no like a conceptual sort of, this signify that, this object signify this. But to me, it's just this very basic stuff that's sort of part of our environment, rocks and trees, and kind of. I cast each of the object, the one stick and one stone, make molds of them, like one each. And then that's it. So I try. So this whole process of it's very different than my normal work, I think, because usually all the other works, usually I would multiply the amount of molds based on the amount of pieces I wanted to create. So the idea is already very clear in the beginning. So if I need 10, if I need 100, I would usually start with 5 molds, or you can multiply it and you can get the work done faster. But with this one, it has to be 1, because that's the whole idea. I wanted to see how it has to be 1, because if it's 2, then it sort of like beats it's redundant. So it has to be 1, and then 1 and 1 only, and then let's see how this one changes over time. The first one, you get the exact replica of the object down to its minute detail, both the stone and the stick. And then after about 50, 60, 70 times onward, the details begin to disappear. So what I get is like still a stick, but it's a different stick over time. And then the funny thing about it is that every time I repeat the process, after a certain amount of time, about 2-3 months onward, I sort of forgot how it looks like in the first place, because I don't have the actual models anymore, because I had to discard them in the process of making the molds, and the molds already changed, and I can't go back, I can't repeat it. So what I have is this trace of the actual, sort of process. When the idea of doing the drawing came, I saw like, oh, I still have these stones. I can use it. Like it is, it gave it a new life in a way, and I didn't have to discard it, but instead I use it as part of the work. So, the first line was actually the contour, like I traced the object that I chose, and then from that sort of expand the line by 1 millimeter outward, and just to see how the shape changed over time, sort of echo the same idea of the ceramics. I collected some branches, like sticks, like small sticks around the house, and I tried to dip them in clay, in slip, the same slip that I used to make the main work in this show. So, and then sort of like do that over time, several times, until they form like a really thick layer of slip covering the object. So instead of capturing the contour of the shape, the form, I actually encase the shape in where, so it's like, oh, okay, it's a opposite way of getting the same result. And then I do that. It's quite experimental because I didn't know whether I'm going to get the result or not. So, and then after a while, and then I put them in the kiln, and then I fire them, and then what I get is this really crumbly, crackly, kind of tiny branches. I want to make the process as transparent as possible, which that when people see it, they can, right, it's so transparent. That's how it's done. Through that transparency, people can find connections with the work instead of boundaries, because if, as much as it's a nice thing to be amazed by certain objects, is that this amazement is actually create distance, because then you have to have a certain distance to be amazed of something. Like a sense of awe comes out of distance. I think a sense of intimacy comes when you eliminate the distance. When you cut out the distance, you get closer to things. You lose that, but on the contrary, you get intimacy. Like what I want is intimacy and connections and a sense of time present in the work. This show sort of signified a process where I see my creative process as shifting a little bit, but not in a major way. I would say deviate, but not in the kind of major way, like 90 degrees or even 180 degrees, but I sort of like branch out, like poetically, it's like a branch, like a stick's like branching out. So in a way, it's like it creates another branch in the practice where I get to explore. The interesting things, like I get to explore topics that's slightly different, but with the same methods. The same thing, like the materials doesn't change, the techniques doesn't change, everything is just it's the same thing, but it's a different idea and different process.